So yes, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. This is our third in a series of HWA focused webinars looking at integrated pest management for HWA. We're going to be discussing throughout the series of the webinars, we've been discussing HWA management options. So on February 26th, we talked about chemical control, and on March 5th, we were joined by Jeff Fidgen and Kirk Hilliard to talk about biological control. And this evening, I'm really excited to be joined by Michael Stastny and James Steenberg to talk about silvicultural control. And towards the end of the talk, we're going to sort of going to make an attempt to kind of stitch it all together and talk about integrating all three of these approaches together, which I think you'll see is a little bit of a novel thing. And so, Nova Scotia perhaps in a unique position to lead some work in really taking an integrated approach to HWA. So I'm going to just stop sharing and introduce my speakers. So James Steenberg is a researcher with the Department of Natural Resources. He's going to start off our talk this evening talking about adaptive silviculture. And we'll be joined after that by Michael Stastny, a researcher with the Canadian Forest Service, who has been working on HWA and in particular silvicultural management geared towards HWA. So James, I'll turn it over to you to start, and then we'll turn to Michael after that, and I'll wrap things up. If folks have questions, please feel free to stick them in the chat. We've taken time at the end of each of these so far to have a little bit of a Q&A. So if there are any questions, feel free to just stick them in the chat there, and we will have time at the end. So without any further delay, James, I can turn it over to you to get started.
Thank you, Matt. Just bear with me for one sec here. Okay. Where are we here? This is the problem when you get fancy with animations. Okay. So, hi, everybody. Can you see me now? I can see myself. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see that.
Looks good on my end, James.
Okay. Now it's in full screen mode. Everyone see it?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you, Matt, and the Medway Community Forest for having me here at the webinar. Looking forward to talking about our research. So, as Matt mentioned, I'm a senior research forester with DNR. Our group does several things, but we lead the research program with DNR on silviculture. And since I came into it, kind of a legacy of my last position, we also handle climate change and forest carbon, and they just mix so nicely together. So I think it's a good fit. So I'm going to talk about a few concepts and ideas today regarding adaptive silviculture, and specifically I'm going to focus on three research trials that we've established in the Western region, close to Medway and Matt's stomping grounds there. And I'm going to build towards the final research project that we're going to talk about that comes into the world of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, but know that I'm kind of a tourist in that area, and that this one project I'm going to talk about was kind of our first foray into Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, coming at it through the lens of silviculture as a tool in the toolbox. So I would be remiss not to mention my team. We've got a forester, Jane Kent, two technicians, Troy Rushton and Carolyn Benvey, our programmer, Peter Bishop, and our manager, Brad Butt, all with DNR, with our forestry division. And just to give, if I can change my slides here, which I may not be able to, hold on, there we go. Just to give a bit of context to the silviculture research program, because it outdates me by a long shot, and it's really an amazing thing that's very unique to Nova Scotia. Like, our jurisdiction has research, data collection, inventory, and monitoring going back more than most other parts of Canada. So while some people might be familiar with our inventory and our inventory permanent sample plots that are measured every year, dating back to the 60s, the silviculture program, which establishes research trials, so deliberate experiments in the woods, and also establishes permanent sample plots within these experimental research trials. It's a bit of a separate thing. It's very deliberate, it's more experimental, and it's meant to inform anyone that does forestry in Nova Scotia and elsewhere, especially in the Maritimes and Land Canada, on best practices and good ideas and good findings for silviculture and data-driven tools. So this program dates back to the 1970s. There's now, this is a little out of date. There's, well over 1,400 permanent sample plots, some no longer active, some affected by Hurricane Fiona, but we span the entire province. And these permanent sample plots we establish in our experimental research trials. They're measured every 5 years, and they're also measured before and after we do a silviculture treatment to get the best data that we can. And of course, there's this program, but there's all, dozens, 185 reforestation surveys and many other studies that are sort of one-off shows, but there's lots to draw from there, and they inform things like, for example, the Silviculture Guide for Ecological Forestry that's currently in practice on Crown land and recommended for private land, and its predecessors, the Forest Management Guide and so forth. Many different studies. You can find them all online. I put some links in this talk, but reach out to me. I've got my email at the end if you want to get more resources. And of course, this research has evolved over the decades, dating back to the 70s with our early focus, and I believe a lot of federal funding and investment into focusing on fiber, softwood fiber production, plantations, pre-commercial thinning. We still do this. This feeds into the zone of the triad, that 3-model zone that we're doing on Crown land with conservation, light touch, ecological forestry, and then a smaller high production zone. But over the years, it's grown, and we've started to look at different forest management practices and silviculture treatments that are becoming more and more relevant to balance different values alongside of fiber, also climate change, biodiversity conservation, carbon, recreation, these kinds of things. So we have lots of different research projects involved with selection management, shelterwoods. More recently, this something called an irregular shelterwood that is kind of the new kid on the block since the Leahy review. And we're constantly putting in new research trials, and I'll talk about some of them today that are a bit different. And of course, one lens on today, and I think on this program as it relates to silviculture, but also the strong linkage of climate change to Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. While it is an invasive pest, it's also very much assisted in establishing in Nova Scotia with the warming climate. So we'll talk about that too. Now, I stole this slide from a talk I gave at the Woodland conferences for small woodland owners, but it's just sort of that spotlight on silviculture, which can mean a lot of things, but what I mean here is on tending types of silviculture, pre-commercial thinning, but some other ones as well, crop tree release, commercial thinning, and so forth. But really that, the roots of this silvicultural intervention was about increasing growth and yield and selecting crop trees that were the most valuable for the industry needs. And that's still very much a case. But as we move into a world of climate change and more adaptive silviculture, I think we need to really highlight how much more these types of interventions can do with regards to favoring species, not only that are important for the forest sector and its economies, but also that are well suited to the future climate. Nova Scotia has a mix of species in our Acadian Wabanaki forest that are better suited to climate, and some are more poorly suited to climate that are more boreal, colder climate species. And so silviculture is a great tool to get at that. Not only does it increase yields and therefore increase carbon removals and storage from the atmosphere in the woods and in forest products, but also it can reduce the vulnerability of stands that are increasingly exposed to wind disturbance, which is our dominant natural disturbance regime. Despite all the fires recently and despite our focus on pests today, wind is kind of the name of the game in Nova Scotia. And in thin stands, this can reduce stress on individual stems, on individual trees from moisture and competition for resources within the soils. So with regards to that, and moving into specifically pre-commercial thinning, I'd like to spotlight a trial that we've been doing in collaboration with Medway Community Forests. something that is often called restoration thinning. You hear a few different names thrown around for this type of treatment. Sometimes mechanical thinning, shear head thinning, or whatever it may be. But essentially what this is that within Nova Scotia, there are certain windows and specifications for stands that are suitable for pre-commercial thinning. And those windows exist, they come from the Silviculture research program, and they exist because these are the times when you expect to get the most sufficient gains in growth and in the other objectives you have for the stand that's being treated with this silvicultural intervention, but also feasibility of people who are actually doing the work, which is not me, thankfully. I'm not the guy with a spacing saw or whatever else walking through that stand. And, if you miss these windows, it becomes increasingly unfeasible to do so. And so I've just put them up now, that what exists for pre-commercial thinning in softwood and hardwood stands. But the issue is, in Nova Scotia, and I think Matt will confirm there's a lot of areas like this in his license area of the Medway Community Forest. There's a lot of areas that were harvested, the 90s, whatever it may be, that have actually grown past this window for successful pre-commercial thinning. But we still want to do something. We want to maintain the forestry objectives, the timber management objectives of these stands. But in today's current reality, we also want to do things with regards to restoring these stands, making them more adapted and resilient to climate change, restoring a term I'm going to throw around in this talk, long-lived, intermediate to tolerant species. So these are our species that are more shade tolerant, and they live longer, and they're the kinds of trees that you expect to find in a stand that's closer to a late successional state. And there's a number of ways to go about this. I think a big focus recently, and we have another research trial in Cumberland County. I know that Medway Community Forests, in collaboration with the Family Forest Network, has done research in this area too. And there's increasing interest in this, what I'll call mechanical pre-commercial thinning. So here you see on the top right there, from the research trial that we're doing right now, a mini excavator with this shear head, a tree shear that's used to do pre-commercial thinning activities in these types of stands that are too big to do traditional pre-commercial thinning with the kinds of equipment that you would use for that treatment. So we're looking at this as an option, as a restoration silvicultural tool. And we're also comparing this to another approach to dealing with this, what's often called too tall PCT, which is manual pre-commercial thinning. So it's getting out the chainsaw and doing pre-commercial thinning this way, which is more labor and cost intensive. But we hope with the research that we're doing, we expect to see the objectives that we're planning for in these research projects, and also just operationally that can still be met with these kinds of interventions. So here's the research trial in Medway Community Forests license area. There's a larger treatment area, a larger block around what you see in yellow that Matt Miller and his folks are treating. But here you see our research trial outlined in the yellow lines. It's 5 hectares. We're doing 2 different treatments of that mechanical PCT that I mentioned, and 2 different treatments of that manual PCT. And of course, doing good science, we have a control to compare against the data that we get from those different treatment types. With regards to the specifications, with pre-commercial thinning, you often look at the spacing that you're after. But here, we drew from a few different sources, including the Family Forest Network's specifications and the research that they've done in this area. And it really focuses on a window of density that we want to get post-treatment. So 1,500 to 3,000 stems per hectare. You want those crop trees. And so trees that are free to grow, fairly free of damage and in good form, that are released on at least 3 sides of the tree from competition, so that they can grow and meet our objectives. And as with the case in most treatments on Crown land now, we focus on our lit species. Like I mentioned, the lit species, red spruce and white pine here. So targeting, primarily balsam fir for removal, among others. But we also, for biodiversity and climate change objectives, focus on some other species as well. So a perfect example in this one here is we have some rare oak trees throughout this treatment area, throughout this research trial. And while they may not be as economically desirable as red spruce, they are well suited to the predicted future climate, and they add biodiversity value to this as well. So they would be something, when come across, that they would favor in the treatment. So that's ongoing. The contractors are just pretty much wrapping this up now, and I hope soon, because we need to finish this before the end of the fiscal year. But they've been doing great work, and it's been really great to coordinate with the Medway Community Forest on this research trial. We have established permanent sample plots in this trial, and as soon as it's done, the silviculture treatment, we will go back and remeasure it to see those effects, and then we'll continue to measure that every 5 years. Here are the pre-treatment conditions. I'm not going to walk you through all of this for the sake of time and for your sanity, but essentially what you see here is those 4 different experimental blocks that we're getting treatments, not the control. So that's manual and mechanical PCT, and there's the numbers for each of them. I believe this is being recorded. You can come back and play around with the numbers. The second line on each row are merchantable stems only. So that would be trees that are greater than 9 centimeters in DBH. And the top row are the trees, all the trees within our permanent sample plots. So within our permanent sample plots, we did a full measurement, which is a full big meal deal, and full credit to our senior technician, Troy, who was doing these measurements often by himself out there in the snow in December, as well as a tally of saplings that are below that size. And you can see the density on average is between 6 and 1,000 stems per hectare. And the trees, as you can see by their height and diameter, are larger than you would typically see in a pre-commercial setting. So we can come back to that if you want a question period, but I'd like to move to a second research trial that we have ongoing in Western region. So this one has 2 important collaborations nationally. DNR is part of a national research network called Diverse. It's funded by NSERC, which is the national government funding body for scientific research. And the focus of this research network is on climate change, silviculture, resilience, and modeling and building functional complexity, which is kind of a $10 word there, but that's a cornerstone of this research network, and you can find it online in our managed forest in Canada. And they have sites all across the country. And the site that was selected in Nova Scotia to do this research was the entire Western ecoregion. So there'll be modeling around climate change and forest change within the entire Western ecoregion, but we're also establishing silviculture trials in this research network. And when you do a silviculture trial, it's no good to do one across 200,000 hectares. You need one particular block, right? So we've been collaborating with West 4, as well as Medway Community Forest and Mi'kmaq Forestry Initiative. We've all met, and everyone's going to have a voice at the table for this research. But we've established a trial that's actually been, the harvest has started just last week or the week before. And the purpose here is kind of a big concept in adaptive silviculture and really in climate change adaptation in forestry. It's called assisted migration. So this means that we don't think that the tree species, and even more than the tree species, the tree genetic types of those species, so the genotypes or the provenances of those genetic sources and the seeds will be suited to the future climate in 50 to 100 years, right? So what happens if we think ahead, because forests move pretty slow. You want to do forest research or forestry, you got to think decades to centuries in advance, right? So what happens if we plant trees now that are better suited to the future climate that we anticipate in Nova Scotia? So we're actually doing that right now. I believe it's either the first or second of this type in Nova Scotia. I know University of New Brunswick is doing work on this area as well. And there are 4 different types of treatments. We don't need to get into all these details. I'm going to show you a map shortly. With replicates, of course, and controls as we do, and permanent sample plots will be established in this area. And within this area that we're looking at, it's really a good case study for climate change in the Western ecoregion in Nova Scotia. So it's not one of your, let's grow sugar maple, red spruce, yellow birch kind of sites, right? There's a lot of this province that has more restricted site conditions because of moisture or nutrient regimes or both. We call those azonal or edaphic sites. And probably the most common one that you'll find in the working forest is the spruce pine forest group, as defined in our forest ecosystem classification guide. So this particular area, it's got a lot of black spruce. as well as, some areas that are mixed wood and maybe a little bit richer in their site conditions. So we got white pine and we've got red oak as well. And when we think about that from a climate change perspective, black spruce is a cold climate boreal species. And while it's a good species for fiber production, albeit slow growing and not very responsive to some types of silviculture, it's a common species in the managed forests. But white pine and red oak are much better suited to the future climate that we anticipate. So we want to kind of push this site away from less adapted species towards white pine, red oak in some of the experimental area. So you can see here the layout of this experimental trial where we're comparing no retention. This is sort of business as usual. Crown land, we don't clear cut anymore, but it's still the most predominant type of harvest method in Nova Scotia. We're 2/3 of Nova Scotia's private land, and by far the most predominant type across Canada. And this exact experimental design is happening in replicate across all of Canada. So we'll compare no retention to an uneven aged type of harvest method. So the methods call here for 20 to 50% retention. 20%, out in Western Canada, that's revolutionary, right? But this is what we've been doing in Nova Scotia for a bit. So what this experimental block will be doing is 50% retention in a treatment that I'll explain momentarily. And then across these two levels of retention, we'll be comparing standard sort of revegetation. So let's plant some black spruce and see what grows, to some assisted migration where we push it towards, with silviculture, towards red oak and white pine. And we're going to plant those species there. But then we're going to get even more thinky outside of the boxy, if I can put it that way, and do this range expansion type of assisted migration, where we're going to look using some scientific tools. And I actually, Matt, I do have a web link. I didn't put it on the slide, but I can put it in the chat after, of the tool that from Diverse Network that helped assist us in this work, looking at the climate proxy for what Nova Scotia might be in the year 2075, and then finding it where it is today. So we're looking at two different areas, the Pacific Northwest in the United States and the New England states in the Northeast United States of America. So we are planning to plant white oak, which would be new for Nova Scotia, Douglas fir from the West Coast, both growing fairly well in coastal maritime conditions, because that is an important factor, according to our tree improvement forester, who's very well versed in these types of areas, and he's involved in this program. And the research network is always asking us, what else? Where do we push the envelope? We don't want to go planting some brand new invasive species we never heard of, but we do want to build seed orchards and collect data for what we might need to do down the line. And then this fourth option in this silviculture trial across the two different levels of retention is, what's your local interest question? And what's Nova Scotia, right? Oftentimes planting is the exception, not the rule, unlike a lot of the boreal areas where this network is situated. So we're going to do adaptive pre-commercial thinning in these types of stands and track that as well. So here's the block. Like I said, I was just down there and got some pictures. They've started what's called a medium retention gap irregular shelter wood. It's a mouthful, but it's a gap shelter wood that's meant, because it's an irregular shelter wood, it's meant to foster regeneration of those lit species that we want, while also building in stand structure, multiple age classes, and resilience. And you can see here in red versus blue, the partial harvest versus the full harvest of the different replicates across this block. And again, it's all of the research that we do, whether it's with Medway, West 4, or whoever else, licensees or private landowners, this research builds on them, because there's a lot of in-kind contribution and willingness to collaborate and participate that our program wouldn't exist without. So that's always important to mention. Now, lastly, I'll mention this. I haven't been tracking my time. Hopefully I'm doing all right. I'll mention this one research trial that predates me until I came into my current role, but it's a really interesting silviculture trial. So it's a tolerant softwood stand, literally a stone's throw from Milton. So I show you a map there with what's called a hillshade, so you can just see the topography in that map. And if I were to expand that map, by twice its size, you would see the river and the town of Milton right there. So it's very close to it. So it's a good one to do tours of, but also it's a good example of an early example, long before the Leahy review and the independent review of forest practices, because this stuff was already well in motion of selection management. So this was, eastern hemlock, red spruce, white pine, dominant species. There is some hardwood components of red oak and red maple, a little bit of yellow birch, but predominantly hemlock, red spruce, white pine. So it was a good candidate for selection management. And they went in there and they removed 1/3 of the basal area in 2008. We got measurements before and after that happened at our 9 permanent sample plots you can see in the map. But then there was a second entry, and we don't have a lot of research on this kind of silviculture on coming back again, because that's what you're meant to do. So we put out these guidelines and we say this is how we do it, but there's not a lot of examples of coming back again and then again and again. And we have a few, fortunately, but it's few and far between. So this one here, it was treated again with another 1/3 removal of the basal area in 2023. And then we established some additional control plots in 2025. And so I'll tell you why. So you see here on this map, in green, there's our permanent sample plots, either stars, which are the new control plots, or our existing ones, the 9 circles. Those purple triangles, rectangles, those are Mi'kmaq archaeological sites of interest that were taken out of the block, which is a great part of this process. And I use the hillshade because topography is part of that and important in determining those areas. So those weren't touched in any of the silviculture or research activities. And then in that northeast corner, it only got the one treatment of selection management in 2008. But then this larger part of the block in the southwest, it got the whole second treatment as well. So that's 2 entries every 15 years. And then in 2025, we started thinking, and well, really in 2024, we see Hemlock Woolly Adelgid in this stand. It's lousy with it. And we could already notice some decline in some of the mature hemlocks. Here's an opportunity for research. And oh, sorry, I meant to show you these graphs. So you can see here the data dating back to 2008. You can see the drop in these variables before and after that first entry. The second entry here, it was just done, so you can see where it happened, and it's only points at this point, where you can see the single entry, 2 entries versus the control, as you might expect. More basal area in the control, but smaller trees. Higher density in the control, of course, and the height is pretty much uniform across, which we wanted. And so our thinking here was that let's merge a gap here. And like I said, I'm a tourist in the area of forest health and Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, but we wanted to get into it and bring our silviculture research perspective. We spoke to a lot of people, our provincial entomologist, Jeff Ogden. We have a provincial strike team, which Matt knows very well, with DNR, and that's a whole project in collaboration with the feds, Medway Community Forest, DNR, and Department of Environment here, treating protected areas for Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. And essentially we thought, well, let's add this treatment to the toolbox of tools that we could use to maybe start to take care of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. You can see the distribution of hemlock here in Nova Scotia. It's not like some of our dominant species. It's not everywhere, right? It's especially prominent in the west, on the other side of the Cobequids near Northumberland Strait. But importantly, it's so central to the old growth forests of Nova Scotia. It has a lot of value. So we want to save it. Obviously, there's lots of work looking at the chemical control of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. So that's the basal spray or injections of the chemicals that help actually literally kill Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. There is biocontrol, which has only just started. Matt knows more about this than me, but they've actually released predatory insects, beetles, and I believe there's a fly that feeds on Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, because in Nova Scotia, they don't have any native predators, right? So they released those in Keji, maybe other places. Matt, you can comment on that later, I don't know. And the kind of thinking is that, well, the chemical control will save us today, the next few years, and hopefully kind of bridge, or sorry, hopefully kind of, the longer term is this biocontrol. These species get established in Nova Scotia. There's no off-target species that get killed, our native insects, and they just really feed on the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid and keep it at bay. But the kind of thinking here was that, well, maybe silviculture can help bridge the gap between those 2 different treatments, where if we thin the stand and each individual tree has more resources, maybe that will help it along, and it'll be better off poised to fight off and stave off the impacts of this invasive species. So here we have an experimental treatment, albeit one and albeit a small one, and we only treated our research plots, not the entire harvest block with the chemicals. But we're going to track this over time. We're going to fly it with drones to look at tree health and see if there's any kind of potential effect across these 3 different levels of silviculture in this stand. And there you can see here a picture from one of our team members, Carolyn, of 2 of our summer students, and Carolyn and the strike team getting ready to go treat trees last year. Now, unfortunately, this was right before a record-setting drought in Nova Scotia, so we hope it still worked well. We're hoping to do more treatment in there this year, but we're excited to see where it goes. And with that, thank you. I hope I didn't speak too long, Matt. Anyone's welcome to reach out. I'll always plug our tools. We have tons of them, but check out our website. You know, we have a free carbon calculator for forest carbon. We have a new version of our provincial growth and yield model, and we're just about to release a tool, a free, easy to use kind of light version of a pre-treatment assessment software that is targeted towards private landowners, but it really could be a resource for anyone that wants to have a look. So thank you very much, and yeah, stay in touch.
Thanks very much, James. Yeah, appreciate the kind of overview of the different adaptive silviculture projects that are going on, and nice to kind of tie into the hemlock work at the end, which is a nice setup for Michael. So I think we will just get right into Michael's talk, and we'll make sure to save some time at the end for questions. So Michael, if you want to pull up your screen and kind of pick up from where James has left off, that'd be great.
Sure, will do.
Looks good.
Awesome. I'll get started. Thanks again for inviting me to this, and thanks to James for this nice introduction. I will not wear a forester's hat for this presentation because I'm more of an ecologist and forest insect ecologist, but I'll introduce this project I've been running for the last 6 years or so in southwest of Nova Scotia on whether we can use silvicultural treatments to mitigate some of the impacts of HWA on hemlock. So we have quite a few tools in our toolbox to manage HWA, but none of them is really the silver bullet. We probably will, in the long run, need a combination of these. There was already a webinar on the chemical control. Jeff and Kirk talked about biological control, which is another project I'm also involved in. So if there are any questions about that, I can speak to that as well. Then there's genetic conservation of the diversity of hemlock, and there's not a whole lot of diversity of hemlock, and that's why it's important to really manage it, because it is under threat at a really large scale. There's some work in the US primarily on host resistance and whether we can have tree improvement programs to breed for more resistant hemlocks. And then finally, there's this idea of silviculture, and I'll introduce why that might be the case. So not to get into the details of the biology of the pest, but when Hemlock Woolly Adelgids attach themselves to the twigs, the base of each needle, they basically tap into these really specialized cells with a really small mouth part. And as a result of their feeding and as a result of the reaction of the tree actually has sort of almost like an immune reaction that causes something called hypersensitive reaction. It causes different things. One is, as the insect is feeding, the tree is starved of carbon. So as it's going through photosynthesis, some of that carbon is basically sucked away by the insects. That changes a lot of allocation of nutrients and nutrient storage, so it can't store as much in its roots over the winter and put as much of its carbon into growth the following season. And then it also causes water stress because the tree basically starts to change its tissues, causing it to feel deprived of water. And so there are a bunch of these different effects of the insect feeding. And one idea of using silviculture is basically to promote resilience of the tree against this pest by opening up the canopy, removing some of the competition for nutrients, water, and so on, and especially increasing light. So you're opening up the canopy, the tree is able to photosynthesize a little more efficiently under the stress. And this is then promoting tree growth and vigor, ideally before any real damage by the insect. So you're trying to do it proactively before the insect might even be there in that particular stand. You're trying to promote the vigor of the trees. And so we started looking at these questions, and there have been some trials of this in the US, but not particularly conclusive, for a variety of reasons I won't get into, but we wanted to take an approach where it was relevant for woodlot owners, and it was also relevant for the industry at sort of a larger stand scale. We've had a number of collaborators over the years, but I just want to highlight Medway Community Forest was really instrumental in getting this project started back in 2019 and have been super supportive ever since. We've had two different approaches, and one in these silviculture trials, and one is using individual tree selection. We have 3 private woodlots. I was actually in a couple of them just the last couple of days. I'm right now on the South Shore, and we have been doing some field work following up on some of these plots. And in these cases, the idea is basically to use this individual removal of certain trees where you're pairing plots that are either intact or thinned, and removing about 20 to 30% of the basal area. Usually it's the competing species of trees, so you might be removing maples and birches and spruce and white pine, or you might also be removing some lower vigor hemlock and retaining the really high vigor, really nice growing hemlock as your study trees. And we've been monitoring about 20 to 25 trees per plot. And I will not get into the results of these other than tell you that we haven't really found anything conclusive, in part because out of these 3 woodlots, only one of them by Bridgetown is a site where the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid has gone through in the recent years following these silvicultural prescriptions and has really impacted the hemlock, and the hemlock is starting to decline. In the other 2 woodlots that are more on the South Shore side of Southwest Nova Scotia, we've seen relatively slow spread of the pest, and because of that, very minimal or almost no impacts on the trees. I was just in the woodlot today where I could find a couple of trees out of maybe 30 that we've looked at closely where there's a little bit of decline. All the other trees just look a little too clean with almost no pest yet, which is a great thing for the woodlot owner. It's not a great thing if you're trying to learn something about whether this silvicultural method is actually helping, because you want to see some impacts on the trees and then compare your thin plots and your intact plots. So I'll have to report on those later on. But we do have another study going on, which has been going on since 2020 of you can say, commercial scale harvesting operation where they're basically strip cut shelterwood plots for treated plots that have had this shelterwood prescription, and 4 intact plots, and about 40% basal area removed. And that was done in the winter of 2020, 2021. And the hemlock there is actually a bit on the younger side. It's often co-dominant or even subdominant. And we've been monitoring these plots actually in a Mi'kmaq artifact area that has created a really neat opportunity to redesign this experiment to look at some additional questions. And I'll just show you a series of graphs since I'm presenting basically research results, but I'll try to guide you through that. The graphs are actually fairly simple. So once the thinning happened, we basically had 2 or 3 years where we just had the plots sit and kind of adjust to the new conditions in the thinned ones. And the intact ones, nothing really happened, so the trees were growing the same way. And then we looked at the level of the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid infestations in year 3. And you can see from this graph, and the dots in the graph are actually each of the dots represents a single tree in these research plots, we're not really seeing much of a difference in the level of infestation between the intact plots and the thin plots. And this is something that has been found in the States as well, that often the thinning, it's not that you're suppressing the adelgid infestations. Sometimes you're in fact actually finding more adelgids. You're just hoping that the trees grow better and can deal with the pest better. I'm also making a little note here that we're not really seeing any effect of thinning on the summer or the winter mortality of the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, and that's something, this is where some of the suppression of the pest can happen simply because of the weather, usually in the winter, but sometimes the summer, a portion of the population dies and the trees get a bit of a break, a bit of a window of recovery. And we're not really seeing that changes between the intact and the thin plots. And there was an idea that if you open up a plot, you're opening up the canopy with the insect on the branches to more elements, more UV, more fluctuations in temperatures, and that would potentially suppress the insect, cause a bit more of this mortality. We're not seeing any effect of that. So it just seems that at least by year 3, we're seeing sort of very similar levels of infestation. But then if we move on and look at the individual branches and measure growth, we are actually seeing more growth in the thin plots. And so you can see on the left side, the intact plots, there's a lot of trees that have zero growth of new shoots, basically no new production of shoots. Whereas in the thin plots, at that point, there was a lot of, it's quite a spread. So it's everything from just a few shoots to quite a lot of shoots. But you could see that by year 3, there was this major stimulus in tree growth in the hemlock as they were released from the competing canopy. And this is something that silviculture is basically hoping to achieve. So this was encouraging to see, but it's a fairly short-term response. We went back in year 4 and year 5 and noticed, looking at something we call crown transparency. It's basically what happens to hemlock as the adelgid starts feeding. You start losing some of the needles, you have fewer and fewer shoots, and the canopy start looking thinner and thinner. And this is something you might have noticed already in some of the impacted stands in the region. And we're not really seeing much of an effect there yet. By years 4 and 5, there's a bit of a decline that seems to be slower in the thin stands compared to the intact stands. So that's good, but it's not a particularly dramatic effect. It's not really a strong difference. But by year 4, one thing that we noticed was now all of a sudden we're seeing a new trend where the pests started increasing in the thin plots. And this was a little bit unexpected, but also at the same time not too surprising. This is something that researchers have been seeing in the States as well, where the vigorous hemlock that have seen less competition because of the thinning are able to produce more shoots, and those shoots then get colonized by the pest. And so you see this increase in the infestation on those thinned trees. What we're hoping to do is basically figure out, is that also corresponding to some level of tolerance or compensation on the part of the hemlock? Is it able to still kind of keep growing in spite of this pressure of the pest? And by year 5, we're not really seeing that. In fact, we're seeing a bit of a discouraging result. And I'll just guide you through this graph because it's showing a slightly different thing. On the y-axis, we have something called shoot length ratio, which is basically comparing how long a new shoot of that year 5, is compared to the shoots of the year 4. And the red line is basically a value of 1. So anything above red line means the new shoots are longer than the previous shoots. And that means the tree is investing a lot into growth. It's really spurred into a lot of shoot production, and the shoots are vigorous and long. If the dots are below this red line, it means the shoots are really short. They're shorter than the last year's shoots because the tree is not able to allocate as much resources. It's been weakened too much by this pest, and the shoots that it's producing, if it's producing any shoots at all, are short. And we are seeing there that in the intact plots where the thinning has not happened, there's quite a major spread. So of course you have shoots that are really short. You also have shoots that are much, much longer. So the trees are quite vigorous. And then on the contrary, in the thin plots, we're actually seeing a suppression where basically all the trees that are producing new shoots, the shoots are really short, the trees are really struggling to get going. And so this is a major result we just saw this past year in 2025. And I'll just give you a bit of an interpretation of what this means, because it's an interesting perspective on how do we interpret this sort of up and down. So we have seen that in the early or intermediate stages of this decline of the trees, these crown assessments, which is what you can do quite easily from the ground, just looking into the canopy, noticing, is it thinning or is it not thinning? You can use binoculars a little bit. These may not give you a full story. Once you look at the individual branches, which is a lot more labor-intensive sampling, you can then notice these trends and changes in growth that are not yet manifested in the crown transparency. And then there's this interplay of the infestations and impact. So you have the pest and its densities going up and down, and then you have the tree and its growth going up and down over time. And I'll just give you a little bit of a tour of that in a cartoon, kind of what that means. So if you imagine this is taking you over time, as time goes on, the insect starts climbing in density. You have this sort of exponential population growth. The next thing that happens is the tree declines. So on the bottom side, you've got the tree response. There's less growth. It's declining because the pest has been impacting it. Now in the next stage, as there are fewer shoots produced by the tree, there's less food for the adelgid. So the adelgid population declines. So there's kind of a drop. It plummets down. When that happens, the tree rebounds a little bit because all of a sudden it's able to save some of its resources. They're not all taken up by the insect. And so the shoot growth goes up. The next thing happens, the pest seizes that opportunity and goes up in its density, and so on. The tree declines again. And so you've got this sort of up and down pattern that can sometimes take quite a few years of these cycles. They're slightly offset. You can see there's a lag time between the rise of the insect and the decline of the tree and vice versa. But this is really what happens over time and progressively, because these impacts are cumulative. Each time the tree is able to recover, it's not actually recovering fully, it's recovering somewhat, but it's still on sort of this downward spiral without some sort of intervention. And so what we see when we sample, let's say this blue shading represents time when we're sampling those trees. We might catch them at a particular time when, let's say, the insects are at low densities and the tree seems to be in the rebound. Now, you can imagine this is in one plot, let's say the thinned plot. If we look at the control plot, maybe we see the opposite. It might be that is following a slightly different trajectory that's out of sync with the other plots because it's following its own history of what's been happening with the pest and what's been happening with the trees. And you might find that the insect is, let's say, going down. The trees are sort of not doing a whole lot. They're still waiting to recover. So this is one of the challenges of these sort of complex dynamics of infestations and impacts over time, and why it takes a number of years before you can really conclude something about whether silviculture is working or not. And this is also why, even though there have been some encouraging results from the US in terms of short-term responses of hemlock, the jury is still out in terms of, do we see any sort of more lasting benefits? And so we're continuing monitoring some of these plots. And of course, we've had that serious drought last year, so we don't really know yet what the effect of that was on the thin plots versus the intact plots, but we're still learning more about the responses. So just to kind of wrap it up a little bit, is there a benefit of thinning? Well, we think there probably is a short-term one, and you could think of that as a window of opportunity potentially, depending on what you're planning to do with your stand, what your other potential tools might be, whether you're thinking of applying chemical control and so on. And so I'll touch on that just in my final slides. The one thing that we have seen a little bit is, at least at our site, which is a very windy site between these two lakes, is that opening up the canopy could potentially be raising the exposure of your trees to dispersing adelgids. They disperse by wind, and so as you do your thinning, there's a lot more canopy available for them to kind of fly around passively just in the wind, and they might settle on your trees a little bit more than when they're in an intact stand, where some of those trees might be a little hidden by a birch or maple or spruce that's right next to it and might not get colonized as fast. So that might be one thing that it's a bit speculative, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the mechanisms why we're actually seeing that, even though these plots that were thinned versus the control plots, they all started at pretty similar adelgid densities. Over time, it seems like our thinned plots actually became more and more colonized by the adelgids. Now, the whole idea of silviculture in the context of Hemlock Woolly Adelgid is that we're hoping to design stands that are more resilient to the pest. And so we're hoping to reduce these impacts on growth. Even if we can't prevent these infestations, we're just hoping that they're not as detrimental to the tree. And so far, the evidence is very mixed. Maybe there's a bit of a short-term benefit. Beyond that, it's really hard to tell yet. And you just need to sort of follow what else we'll learn in the coming years. We're not really seeing that this thinning is in any way promoting mortality of the adelgid due to these weather events, that there's more exposure to the elements. So that does not seem to be supported at all by our results. Now, one of the ideas of silviculture is that it's buying you time to implement some of the other tactics. And one of the potential ideas is that you do your thinning, you see some positive promotion of growth in the hemlock, and in the meantime, you start to come up with some other longer-term strategies. And I think Matt will probably get into that, so I won't steal too much of that topic. But the other thing to consider is saving the trees themselves is one thing, but a lot of times what we're interested in is also saving the hemlock habitat and the ecosystem that they support as foundation species and a lot of the ecosystem services. And I think that's where silviculture has a little bit of a harder sell, because if you're hoping to retain some of these hemlock ecosystems, but you're going in and taking out quite a few trees, they might not be hemlock, but if your woodlot, let's say, is 70 or 80% hemlock, if you're thinning, a lot of the trees you'll take out will be hemlock. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how much am I changing that stand and that whole ecosystem, that whole habitat, by taking out potentially some of the trees? And whether it's something that you want to do depends on the stand, on its age structure, and so on, how old the hemlock is. It seems to us, at least so far, that we might be more successful in promoting silviculture in the younger hemlock, so where hemlock is subdominant or co-dominant rather than sort of old mature stands. And it also depends on the site characteristics. So if your hemlock is primarily a riparian, you may not actually have too many options to use silviculture to go in and do any kind of harvesting. You may need to think of other approaches. And then finally, just the last slide, how do we integrate silviculture with these other tactics? And I think Matt will talk about more of this, but one idea is that this could be an opportunity where you're transitioning your stand, promoting hemlock growth for a few years before the insect is even there. So doing it proactively, and then at the same time using it as an opportunity to plan for chemical control on the remaining trees that you have. And this might also just be more feasible if, let's say, your stand is 70% hemlock. There's no way you can use insecticides on that many trees. It just becomes really expensive. Can you use some harvesting to fund some of your chemical control? And also potentially, if you're then reducing your stand, let's say from 70% hemlock to 30% hemlock, you have fewer trees to worry about later on, and you might have an easier time managing those and preventing their decline because you can focus on them. And then finally, there's one idea, and this is more of a longer term thing, that thinned stands, because the hemlock might be able to persist there longer, could promote persistence of biocontrol agents once they start spreading over the landscape and providing some long-term solution for this pest. So I guess the take-home message would be that really silviculture is always about managing the stands proactively, preventing this sort of preemptive harvesting of hemlock, avoiding that, and promoting regeneration and restoration, and having sort of a long-term mindset, long-term planning as part of the solution. So really, whatever gains you see on the part of hemlock, really the idea is to look ahead and think about it on a decades-long scale. And hopefully by that point, we have some other tools in our toolbox that we can integrate with silviculture and chemical control. So thanks again for your time. I think Matt will probably want to wait until questions later on, but one thing that I'll mention with this final slide is you also want to think about wind and blowdown as a result of your thinning. This is our site that's between two lakes, and it's very impacted by wind as a result of some of that thinning. Not all sites are like that, but anytime you open it up, you're running a bit of a risk that you'll have some hemlock down either directly because of wind or just collateral damage with spruce coming down. So thanks so much again, and I'll stop my sharing.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to just share my screen here quickly and jump right into it. I just want to say to folks, I am aware we're over time. That's been the case, I think, in all of our webinars. So, but if folks are do have somewhere to be, certainly we are recording these webinars, and we will be sending them out to all the registrants. So yeah, I'd love if you could stick around, but I know we're a little over time. That's okay. Yeah, so thank you very much, Micah. You touched on a couple of things, you know, in particular the impact of timing, and you know, some of the trends that I've seen in my time in particular engaging with woodlot owners is, you know, encouraging folks not to panic and liquidate harvesting. I mean, that's seeing a lot of concerns, and certainly some of that behavior happening, but then also not waiting too long. I think timing is really important. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of examples of some silviculture with an eye towards HWA. Yeah, try to kind of pull things together at the end on integrated pest management. But just to reinforce, silviculture alone will not prevent HWA or save your trees. We see it as part of an early intervention strategy to sustain growth and resiliency on your woodlot. My thinking is this is best seen as a mitigative approach, in particular, as Michael said, high hemlock component in a stand on your woodlot or throughout your woodlot. Where chemical control may not be feasible. I've had the pleasure of working all over Nova Scotia, and in particular on the northern half of the province. The hemlock seems to be ecologically a little bit younger, and so we see a lot of even age stands that where the pest isn't there yet, an opportunity to really improve the resiliency and diversify those stands. So a couple of things, as Michael touched on, thinning to promote vigor can help trees increase growth in advance of this infestation. And there could be benefits of this for chemical control as well. But for a period of time, and it sounds like it takes about 3 years, which fits with my experience in terms of silvicultural response. If you're acting in advance of the infestation, you can see a bit of that increased growth. Another approach on the diversification side is this idea of creating small canopy gaps to diversify forest stands and increase overall resiliency while keeping later successional features. So often with the canopy gaps, you're more thinking about the regen that you might want to that you might be trying to capture, and oftentimes thinking about increasing components of other species. The example here I'll speak about at Jeremy's Bay Campground at Kejimkujik National Park, targeting the removal of hemlock to try to promote red spruce, white pine, and red oak, either through natural regeneration and underplanting. So this idea of diversification and trying to increase resiliency by reducing the amount of hemlock while maintaining a mature forest structure. Often we talk these approaches targeting unhealthy hemlocks for removal. When you are integrating a number of these tools like chemical control, you want to have your healthiest, best trees free of physical damage, good form, deep crowns, vigorous trees that can help uptake the products. And so often we talk about targeting those unhealthy hemlocks for removal while retaining those higher quality and more resilient trees, either for treatment or as permanent retention. One of the things to consider is the regeneration requirements of the different species that you may be working with. And hemlock tends to require or respond to scarification of the soil in order for the seed to establish. And so harvesting in the winter or harvesting with a cut-to-length system as opposed to skidding, both of those strategies with some snow on the ground to avoid ground disturbance, or doing cut to length where you're not dragging trees across the forest floor, can reduce scarification and help to promote other regeneration rather than just regenerating hemlock. And in addition to wind throw, and I totally hear you on that, Michael, definitely a concern, especially in these more pervasive sort of crown thinning approaches, but also very important to be mindful of ground disturbance, in particular rutting, because hemlocks do have, I mean, all trees are sensitive in their roots, but hemlock in particular tends to have a sensitive root system. So just a couple of things to keep in mind in terms of framing how this tool can work, and some of the rules or general principles that you'd want to consider if you were looking at silviculture as part of your approach to hemlock management. I want to talk about a project that's actually ongoing right now briefly. In 2020, MCFC was hired to establish a silviculture operating plan for Jeremy's Bay Campground. A photo in the previous slide was from that operation. And so the approach was approximately 20% of removal of hemlocks from across 30 hectares of the campground. Some of those stands in the campground were over 90% of the trees that were present were hemlock. So definitely a concern in terms of, you know, high cost for trying to chemical control. And the goal is to try to maintain, you know, that mature forest structure as best as we can, as best as possible. So again, focusing on removing those declining, diseased or damaged trees. And in selecting trees to remove during a harvest, looking for opportunities to release or promote non-hemlock species. So white pine, red spruce, red oak, white birch, and red maple were all present in the stand. And so selecting to remove hemlocks that were interfering with those non-hemlock species as a way to try to improve the overall resiliency. And I think a lot of credit to Kejimkujik right now. I see them as a leader in terms of integrating all three of these approaches that we're talking about. They are, and so this silviculture operating plan was meant to be used in combination with other efforts, and really to try to complement those other efforts. So in addition to the harvest, there was also chemical control of the healthiest trees to maintain that hemlock component as best they could, underplanting of a variety of long-lived and climate-adaptive species. And they've even got biocontrol now releases happening over the last number of years in the park. And so to my eye, I really see Kejimkujik as the only place, and certainly the first and a leader in terms of having all three of these tools, chemical control, biocontrol, and silviculture, all working in combination with one another to help maintain the campground. And it's interesting that Keji actually did a similar approach in about 15 or 20 years ago. They, in the same part of the campground, they had a very bad pale wing gray moth outbreak, and they actually harvested some trees at the same time where they were heavily impacted by that pest. And the regeneration response, in particular with white pine, has been excellent. And so there's a real blueprint there in terms of, you know, that diversification with an eye towards maintaining resiliency. So this is a map of the harvest, and so these areas over here on the left were done first by Keji Park staff, and then in the winter of 2024, MCFC worked with Atlantic Tree Solutions, a tree service and harvesting company from Truro, Really unique, low impact, small scale harvesting equipment. Mitch and his team are really excellent in terms of having a unique sort of sensitive approach with small gear, which really fits. So we operated in 2024 along the north section of Jeremy's Bay here. And actually today I was in to check on the operation. We're wrapping up here over the next few days, working along this other loop, and with an eye towards completing the work there. So yeah, so this area in yellow we operated in 2024, and then we're covering the rest of this green area. Yeah, hoping to wrap up within the next few days. Couple of pictures from the operation here on the left. These 3 photos on the left were from the first. So you can see this is the small excavator, about a 6-ton excavator, really small equipment, small tractor and loader. This was an area where we didn't even remove the trees. They were just left as coarse woody material. There wasn't a lot of dead wood on the ground, and so it was seen as an opportunity to increase the amount of dead wood and all the benefits that go along with this. Mitch has since upgraded his machine a little bit. So this is a small, still very small, only about the size of a small tractor, a little bit longer reach, a little bit more power in terms of the harvesting head, but still very light touch, light equipment as compared to what you'd see in more of an industrial setting. And again, I mentioned complementing other efforts. So there's been a tremendous amount of tree planting, underplanting of oak and maple and yellow birch, softwoods as well, trying to increase the diversity of what was in some places, as I mentioned, 90% hemlock forest. Yeah, and sort of putting it all together, and I would say it's tough to really find examples in the research or in practice of integration of these 3 tools. There is this paper, I'm going to put a link to it in the chat, that looks at integrating biological and chemical control. So the idea, we talk about chemical control as a short-term solution, and with biological control being the long-term solution. And so there's been some research that I was able to find that looks at that sort of transition from a chemically controlled stand over into integrating biocontrol. So you can see the different sort of colors and symbology of the trees here, where some trees have been left unprotected, which is important to maintain a food source for eventual release of the predator insects. Some of the trees would be temporarily, kind of partially protected, and then some of them would be perpetually your sort of most high value trees. You may consider perpetual control, and then eventually you're releasing the predators onto the trees that have never been protected. And so I kind of imagine a similar approach as this, but you're imagining this same graph here with some harvesting, either creation of gaps to promote resiliency and diversity, or harvesting of trees to improve growth on trees that you may protect. So I really think there's an opportunity for Nova Scotia to pioneer research and practice into integrating all 3 of these tools. Our forests are uniquely hemlock dominated up here, and so and where there hasn't been much effort in this respect, I think it's a great opportunity. And I wonder, and Michael spoke to this notion of combining our efforts. So thinning ahead of a chemical treatment to improve the efficacy, right? So that burst in growth that you see 3 years after a thinning operation would be potentially, I say question mark because I don't know. This is perhaps a question that could be looked at, where that increase of growth that you see as a result of thinning could help uptake, could help the uptake of the chemical, and potentially could extend the window after infestation where chemical control could still be effective. So that'd be one area I think of immediate sort of opportunity to look at the combination of thinning and chemical control and efficacy of the insecticides. And again, I'm kind of repeating here, but the general approach of thinning to promote vigor of non-hemlock trees, as a diversification. So often we're finding other species present within these stands, and we would promote those as a diversification. Also trying to promote the vigor of the trees that you're going to treat, helping to make sure that they stay healthy over the long term. Small canopy gaps that can help promote diversity by recruiting other regen, and then integrate biocontrol as that program becomes more mature and that option becomes more available. There's not much for resources out there right now. One of our goals at MCFC is to create a silviculture guide for HWA management, but we're not there yet. But there is, and I'll put a link to this paper, to this guide in the chat when I'm finished here. Silvicultural options for managing hemlock forests threatened by HWA. And this looks at, the focus here is in this image that I'm showing is silviculture approach without chemical treatment. And what we're seeing here is really looking at harvesting of trees to in the window of decline as this stand that is being sort of theorized here is going to decline from HWA, looking at the removal of some trees that would help speed up succession and increase resiliency. So on the left, without any removal, the light that because the canopy would decline more slowly under a no harvesting or no silviculture scenario, you're going to see a slower sort of rate of light hitting the ground and seeing that slower initiation of regen within the understory. And so you can see in year 5 versus year 15, whereas on the right, doing some harvesting individual trees, small gaps, and trying to help increase the rate of regen recruitment and speed up the growth of those trees to help, to help increase that diversity.